Okay, we'll go ahead and get started here. Still some people joining in online. My name is Dr. Jay Parsons. I'm a professor and director of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the Department of Agricultural Economics. And today is a part of our weekly webinar series, which we typically hold every Thursday at noon live. It will be recorded and archived on our center's website. The URL for that website is cap.unl.edu. So that's cap.unl.edu. And if you go there and find webinars on the menu up at the top, you can see all of our past webinar recordings up there, and then a listing of the upcoming webinars and a link there to go ahead and register for those. So today's webinar is measuring up perennial forage versus row crop. And this comes about because with tight row crop margins and increased expenses associated with those row crops, some producers are wondering if this might be the time to incorporate a perennial forage into their cropping systems. So on this webinar, we're going to focus on the economics of perennial forages versus row crops. Last week, we did a webinar on annual forages, and that is archived up on our website if you're interested in taking a look at that. From a risk management standpoint, we're going to be looking here at the benefits of perennial forages and row crops, how they measure up with each other, and going through some different economics and some numbers on them, which of course are going to be unique to your situation. So we'll be showing you some different examples to think about to plug in actual costs that you may have. So joining me to present is Dr. Daren Redfearn. He's a professor and extension forage and crop residue specialist here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the Department of Agronomy and Horticulture. And so I'm glad to have you on today, Daren. Hi, how you doing?
Doing very well, Jay. Certainly excited about some of this information that we're going to present today. You know, having spent several hours chatting with you this week over this particular webinar. So I hope we have some good information today.
Yeah, and it's been a joy putting this together. Also, as Daren mentioned, a bit of a challenge with some of all the different things that we could talk about, and we are limited on time today. So we'll try to hit on what we think are the most important points. And with that in mind, let me just give you our key points and objectives, take-home points. I already mentioned the first one, that we have these tight profit margins here with our traditional commodity crops. And so people are asking about forages and perennial forages in particular, a topic here today. And of course, one of the things with perennial forages that people really need to think about is the fact that this is a multi-year commitment, because you do have fairly significant establishment costs, and the word perennial means it's coming back every year. So you want to recoup those over a number of years. And so we'll talk about those establishment costs today, and then how that may amortize out over the year and manifest itself in annual costs versus annual returns, similar to what we're used to seeing on row crops. But certainly something you want to consider in how long you're committed to these perennial crops, and how long that stand needs to be productive for you. So some of the key questions that we hope to address today, or hope to at least give you stimulation to think about. One of them, of course, is how are you going to harvest the revenue from that forage? Where we'll talk today mostly about grazing it, but you certainly can harvest it for hay and rent it out to others, those types of things. What type of forage you're actually going to plant there when we're talking about these warm season versus cool season. When is it that you plan to use it? Can make a difference there, and certainly on the productivity side also. How does this fit into your long-term strategy? As we already mentioned, this is a multi-year commitment. How does this fit into your use of your cropland over the long term? So we mainly want you to be thinking about these questions. We'll be giving you some numbers to think about along the way, and then how, if and how you want to incorporate perennial forages into your crop acres. So, Daren, does that bring anything to mind for you that you want to add before we get started?
Oh, I mean, I think you've hit the key points there, and the big one is that multi-year commitment, and you indicated about our focus today will be on the grazing piece to that, and not necessarily a hay harvesting situation. But kind of before we get started, we are going to talk about three examples today. One of them is going to be a warm season, and then we'll talk about an irrigated and also a dry land cool season, and then some of the particulars about either one of those. So Jay has moved on to the warm season one. That's always the one that is kind of as a forage guy, I think in Nebraska, at least where we have a lot of the planted pastures. Warm seasons tend to be the one that's often not. We often tend to be lacking in summer grazing, if you will. There's usually plenty acres of cool season around. Doesn't really add much to the flexibility of the system if you plant more cool seasons into an already cool season dominated system. But looking at the warm seasons, and again, these are examples, and as Jay indicated, some of these are, many of these will be different situations, but generally, what we put together for this one included a warm season grass mix. Those warm season mixes on a per pound of pure live seed basis can be quite expensive. This particular one is $15 per pound of PLS. In this example, we use a 10-pound PLS seeding rate of a low diversity warm season mixture, which includes big blue stem and Indian grass. Both of those can be quite productive. Side oats grama is typically, or not a side oats grama, it is side oats grama, is the other one that's typically included in that. Over time, that side oats grama typically will be replaced by either the big blue stem or the Indian grass, which are more productive. Next set of cost items. That glyphosate application at establishment, that early weed control is critical to the establishment of these warm season perennial grasses. They're awfully slow to germinate and establish. We don't recommend having any fertilizer during establishment. You've got the seeding cost, and then you've got a quinclorac plus an application at about $40. That's one that's post-emergence to basically take care of some of the annual grasses that you have, and also the broadleaves during the part of the mid part of the summer. And then we've got the interest on the operations at about nine and a half bucks. Total of that somewhere between $239 and $240 per acre in this example. I know a lot of times the first place we start looking or to cut establishment cost in these perennial systems. The establishment is often not a good place to try to reduce those. Certainly for the warm seasons, the reduction in the weed control is I'll argue with that one a long time with you about whether to eliminate or reduce that or not. You might be able to reduce the seeding rate a little bit, and you might find some difference in the seed cost, but generally you're still going to be looking at somewhere just under $250 an acre just to get these warm season perennials established. After they're established, beginning in year 2 through year, they will use 10 in this example. You've got a minimal fertilizer cost. We recommend 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That seems that it stimulates that growth and results in some thicker stands of these warm season grasses. We included a maintenance cost that might include fencing, might include livestock water, may include some additional herbicide to clean these up periodically. We assigned a cost of about $10 per acre. Then the annual interest on the operations is a little over $2. So this subtotal for these yearly maintenance costs, these are things that we have to consider every year, is about $51. If we look at that $240 establishment cost, amortize that over 5 years at a 5% interest, that annual cost then on a per acre basis is about $31. So our total annual cost for warm season perennial grass pasture is around $80. In our example, we're about $82 there. So, some of these again will be different. Some of them may be much different for many of you, but again, this is what we're using in our comparison to row crop production. If we look at trying to look a little bit at the beginning to assign some kind of value to this production, again, that year one, and that's not the establishment year, that's the first production year. So that first production year includes those year zero costs, if you will, in there as well. If you look at the dollars per AUM, those AUMs are going to cost you about a little over $140 per AUM. That doesn't look too good. This first year of production is only going to be about 75% of the total production potential. In years 2 through 15, we're looking at the maximum production of about 4 AUMs per acre. Again, these are pretty conservative values. There are years where this production will be a little bit greater, years that it might be lower, but I think that 4 AUMs once it's established is going to be a pretty good guess. So if you move down to 10 years, that 9706, that's the one that represents that $82, and that's a little bit different. I think it includes some other interest and maybe some rounding error on some of the math that we've done. But if you look at the value in AUMs at 10 years, those AUMs only cost about a little over $24 per AUM. Jay, you have any comments on that?
Yeah, no, I just add that 97 and 82 down on that previous page, the 82, we did not include establishment costs for water and fence, assuming that, you actually had something there to work with. We just include the maintenance cost on that previous slide. On this one, we threw in, I think, about 15 or 16 bucks worth of establishment costs amortized out. That'll vary, of course, by people and whether they have it fenced already, have access to water there already, or whatnot. But we just tell you, we added that in here, so that's why that's a little bit higher.
All right, this is a non-irrigated or dry land cool season perennial grass. Again, the first thing you note is that seed cost is getting about half of what the warm season grass mix was. Part of this is because the cost per pound of PLS is much lower. Again, we recommend a burn down at planting. You've got your seeding cost. And in this instance, we do have a starter fertilizer cost of about 18 bucks per acre. Then the interest is a little over $5, which is going to cost this example somewhere between $130, $131 per acre. So the initial establishment cost of these cool season perennials are quite a bit lower than they are for the warm season perennials. I will point out in this mixture, this fertilizer application is the example is 150 pounds. Since this is a dry land, this is one that was in one of the grass budgets, so we had just pull that down and use that. That's a place that you could possibly look at cutting a little bit of the cost. But again, in this example, we've got about 99 bucks for fertilizer. Again, $10 on the maintenance or that fencing, water, herbicide, and those sort of things. $4.50 on the interest of the operations. That yearly maintenance is going to be about 113 bucks. That next row there, our amortized establishment costs, because those are much lower. Again, at 5% interest over 10 years, that's about almost 17 bucks an acre for the cool season perennial pasture. So once you start looking at both of these examples from the year 0 to the all the way out to year 10, those establishment costs do moderate quite a bit and become a little bit more palatable, if you will, even though the upfront costs are such high. Looking at total annual cost again, that's going to be about $130 an acre. So it's pretty similar to the establishment cost, but again, that's because of that high maintenance subtotal with that high fertilization rate. Jay, again, similar to the first example we looked at with the warm seasons. Big difference on this one is that year 1 production. We don't have a year 0, so all those establishment costs show up in the year that they actually occur. But again, the value of those AUMs in year 1 for this are pretty high. If you move down to the 10-year time frame, again, they're approaching $50 per AUM, but are not quite there. And again, we'll see in a bit that $145.44 cost per acre.
Yeah, and on this one, that we also threw in that about $15 establishment for the water and fence if you had it, right? The math is easy on this one because at 3 AUMs, that's about $5 an acre over here. So if you had to pay to get that stuff in place or paid that amount of money to get that stuff in place and amortize it out, it'd be there. If not, you already have it there and you just have your maintenance costs.
Okay, this example is what we put together for establishing and maintaining irrigated cool season perennial grass pasture. And it's a much busier slide than either one of those other two, mostly because of the irrigation piece that's in there. But again, that grass seed mixture, $67.50. It's effectively the same one that we used on the dry land. Again, you've got the $20 for the burn down at planting, $20 for planting itself. You've got the cost of starter fertilizer. And then again, we included in this one a fall irrigation cost of about 3 inches. Not that that's a place that if you've got some decent precipitation in the fall, you may or may not include that. So that's one area that where you could reduce the establishment cost. But again, establishment cost on this irrigated cool season perennial grass pastures a little bit less than $175 an acre. Looking over at the yearly maintenance cost, again, this one is a similar nitrogen rate as the dry land, but it is a bit higher. And again, this one was pulled from our irrigated grass budgets. But that's a little over $100 there for the fertilization and the application. The irrigation, and we included up to 12 inches of this at about $160. So you can start to look at these maintenance cost items, and that fertilizer and irrigation, those are far and away the largest cost of those yearly maintenance costs of these irrigated cool seasons. We had the $10 maintenance cost, interest on operations, a little over $11. That yearly maintenance cost again is a little over $285 an acre. The establishment cost amortized over 10 years is about $22. So that total annual cost for irrigated cool season is a little over $300 an acre. I will tell you that when we start looking at that, because these yields are so high, a lot of this costs become very cost efficient pretty early in this next slide we'll look at. So again, looking at year 1, even though you do have those high establishment costs and maintenance costs in year 1, the value of the AUMs are about $57. 10 years down the road, they're between $31, $32 per AUM. Another thing to note in this is these values are much more compressed than the values for both the warm season that was dry land and the cool season that was dry land. primarily because this one has much greater yields. We use about 10 and a quarter AUMs per acre in these irrigated scenarios. That included almost 6.5 AUMs in the spring and nearly 4 for the fall production throughout the 15 years that we looked at the budgets on these.
Yeah, and I just mentioned that, we do have our crop budget website, or what we call our ag budget calculator program is up there. You can pull down our 2024 crop budgets in PDF or Excel format on our website, and you see the URL there. The QR code's there if you have a phone handy and want to bookmark it on your phone. But we also have this online ag budget calculator tool, and that's some of those numbers that Daren was just going through, in particular for irrigation. That's based off of what we have built into our budget. So that includes we assumed a diesel powered well. We assume some labor charges attached to that, some maintenance on the well and the center pivot attached to that, and then the ownership on those assets too, ownership costs. So all of that's included in there. So just so you know that that's where that $40 for those 3 inches and $160 for that 12 inches came from. But similar on the custom rate charges also that we had in there, we have a custom rate survey that we do every other year. So the last report we have out is from 2022. We're currently collecting data for 2024. That too is also up on our website. So some of those charges that were assumed in those numbers that Daren referred to, you can go look up those values that we've surveyed, not just on a statewide basis averages, but also by different regions, if you're interested in what some of those things cost. So we just went through the cost side of things, what it costs to get it established, maybe for the different scenarios, and then how those would amortize out over 10, 15 years, depending on how long you expect that to last. We want to spend a little bit talking about the value side here too, because as you produce those forages, of course, you want to capture some of that value. And we're assuming here in general, our default is that you're going to be grazing them. So you're going to be capturing some animal unit months of grazing on there. This is from our last real estate market report survey across the state. We basically collect data on what the average is in each of the 8 crop reporting districts for cow-calf pair monthly rates, which you see up here on the top line, but you also see what the high third average of the high third, and the average of the low third looks like. This line percentage change is the percentage change from the previous year. One of the things to keep in mind here when you're talking about the switch from row crops to a forage is, row crops, we could see things bounce around quite a bit with the prices for corn and soybeans, for example, and I'll show you that on the next couple of slides. But these forages tend to, even though hay prices might bounce around quite a bit, grazing rates tend to just be on an upward slope. They may level off for a few years. They may dip down slightly for 1 year, but in general, they're kind of like land values. They're generally on an upward trend. So keep that in mind when we talk about a 10-year commitment to an annual forage. Odds are pretty good, or not an annual, a perennial forage. Odds are pretty good that, from year 1 to year 10, you're going to see, some of these increases that we generally see, 3-4% annual increases in grazing rates. So the value of that AUM tends to go up. This bottom piece is just another way to do it. That is, if you're trading off some of this grazing resource that you're creating here with this perennial forage on cropland with the alternative of hay, this is how that might trade off. This is pretty unrealistic, idealistic, depending on the term you want to use. But basically the idea here would be if you had $150 hay, for example, and you looked at that at 2.5 AUMs and just did the math, that would equate out to $60 per AUM. But of course, the assumption there is that this is good quality hay and you actually waste none of it, right? And there's not other costs attached to it. So that's super idealistic. If you add other costs, say transportation costs, et cetera, and then some waste to it, you could easily add another 30, 33 or another another 1/3 to that cost. So $150 could easily inflate. You're actually paying that on the market for the hay, could easily inflate to about $200 effective cost per ton that's consumed by the cattle. So that $60 an AUM could easily be $80 an AUM when you factor in the cost of actually getting the hay into the cattle. So keep that in mind as a comparison. That'd be on par with some of the stuff that we're seeing up here with the grazing rates, but certainly grazing's not becoming cheaper, right? So we mentioned the tight margins on corn and soybeans. So when we start comparing some of those things, perhaps some of the values that we're getting out of that $80 an AUM, say for 3 AUMs, that'd be $240 minus the cost. How does that compare? What kind of margins do we need there to compare to corn and soybeans? These are the margins for corn. This is for data from the ERS. So 2021, 22, and 23 is looking backwards. The value of production you see up here fairly high, $900 and up. We've had some pretty good prices there. This is assuming national average corn yields and the also the national. I think this has the state average price in it, if I remember right, for corn in that marketing year. But anyway, we see pretty good numbers coming out of that in terms of just the actual gross margin when you take out the operating costs. When you throw in the overhead and the labor and then the capital recovery on machinery, still pretty good margin sitting there. But the reason that we're getting all these questions is what's happening, what's projected for 2024, right? And so the big dip here is this change in market price that we've seen in corn in this example over the last year or 2 years. It's gone down quite a bit. And at the same time, our operating costs, even though they might have gone down slightly from that big jump we saw in fertilizer costs back in 2022, they haven't gone down comparably. So these margins have tightened up over time. And the current projection is about $150 an acre. That, of course, would have to cover your land costs, right? So if you're paying, $250 an acre in cash rent for this, that's not going to do it, right? You're going to be in the red. Soybeans, a little bit better, but not much. Current projections are about $170 for that margin to go back and contribute to that land cost. But again, we see a similar pattern where it's dipped down the last couple of years, primarily with the loss in that gross value of production. And even though operating costs have gone down slightly, not near as drastically as that revenue side. So that's that comparison. If we go back to what Daren had up there earlier and convert some of those AUMs into a value using, and I used $80 an AUM here as far as its value. So if we went through and we had that 10.25 AUM yield off of this at $80, that'd be about $800 in revenue. And we start to see numbers that are very comparable in terms of net return, that those look pretty favorable to that corn and soybeans, even in the good years, right? Even in the good years that we had a couple of years ago, $400 or $500 to have returns to land looks pretty darn solid. So on the irrigated perennials that we had, cool season, the example that Daren had there, the costs are just exactly what he put up before. Attach that revenue to it, you see it's fairly competitive with corn. If you go away from the irrigated and you're looking at perennial cool season in this case, takes a couple years before you could say that you're back in the black where it's a net positive for you. And then you get some recovery there, but still you're looking, at least our projections here, about $100 return. Again, this is non-irrigated, right? But this would be about $100 return per acre on that in terms of the net. That would have to go back to the land costs, right? Warm season gets a little bit better. You recover a little bit sooner some of those costs, but then you're getting up in that $200 return to the land if you get that thing to span out over 10 or 15 years there. So looking pretty good if you can get at least 10 years out of it, fairly competitive. But yeah, things to consider there as far as how that pans out on the net side and competitiveness to corn and soybeans. So the other thing to keep in mind is, of course, how things fit into your whole system. So, Darren, I'm going to let you speak to this and where these forages may be utilized, and how this might work out in terms of that picture.
Yeah, Mary showed a graphic similar to this last week. For those of you that were have attended both of these webinars, but I think when the approach we're looking at here is how to best and efficiently use our resources. As you think about this, I mean it's almost the I think that irrigated cool season is a little bit self-explanatory there, so we'll go through it first. But Mary used a comparison last week, and we're using the same one this week just so that you can just to keep everything consistent. But hay at $160 a ton with a little bit of waste there is about $78 an AUM. So on our irrigated example, we use that $78 value, multiplied that by the production, the 10.25 AUMs per acre. And then our value of that was almost $800. To get the comparison over to the row crops, we subtracted out the annual forage costs, which were those in that year 10 example that you guys just had seen. And so that number for the irrigated cool season perennial, that $475 an acre is that's available to cover the land cost. So as we've already talked about and discovered, that those irrigated cool season perennials can look pretty good if you do have a lot of that infrastructure already in place. And so I showed a calendar up there, if you will. Those cool season perennials, whether you're talking about the irrigated or the dry land, probably a better option for planting would be in the previous fall to when you want to graze those grasses. You can plant them in the spring and you can have some success, but the planting date is going to be right on the very front end of when you would be grazing those. Okay, so you would give up some grazing by delaying the planting until the spring. Also have to probably pay a little bit better attention to some of the summer weed control, in particular in those in that non-irrigated or the dryland cool season grass. Effectively, you may not get any spring grazing at all, and may get only a little bit of grazing in the spring, and may only get a little bit of grazing in the fall. Typically, what we see with the non-irrigated grasses are got it indicated in a yellow bar there during the heat of the summer. They're not very productive. There is some grass there, but the quality of it is pretty low. Palatability of it is pretty low, so it's has much higher quality in the spring than that fall regrowth, which is going to depend on timely precipitation. Why it's a little lighter shade of green. I would call it reliable, but not very dependable. So that's kind of that situation. So following a similar thought process with that dryland cool season perennial, again, you've got that $78 value that we're using to compare these. And again, these values, at least in my mind, are a bit on the conservative side, but a production of 3 AUMs per acre. That value of that's about $234. Subtracting the annual forage cost out of that gives you $88 to cover the land costs, which is the reason you saw the red numbers on some of those that figure that Jay talked about. The intriguing piece to this to me are these dryland warm season perennials. They do have a little bit higher production than the cool season perennials. In areas where you say that cool season perennial, I get greater production than 3 AUMs per acre. You would also get greater production per acre out of the warm seasons as well. So to keep in mind as you're playing with those. But again, the value of that is $312 because it doesn't have the high fertilization cost included in our example. Those annual forage costs are $97 an acre. So you've got about almost $215 in these warm seasons to cover the land cost. And so I think a lot of that is borne out. It's some of you may be thinking, some of you may gonna ask, it's about the type of land. I mean, I the only type of land that I would plan a forage on would be something that wasn't prime farmland. Uh, that class one and class two land for the most part is going to be better served for row crop production. These marginal areas, and you hear marginal land talked about quite a bit. I don't know that there's a really good definition of marginal land, but I think if you kind of keep that to consistent, kind of what we work with internally in the small groups that I work with is marginal land we would probably define as acres with production that's less than 75% of the county average. So it's going to be lower in production potential for grain crops, but it would be much, much more suited for forages potentially than the grain crops. So, again, the if there's a no-brainer in this, it's almost that irrigated perennial grasses. The thing that is struck me talking about this, and I didn't make that comparison. I know Mary talked about this last week about comparing or including the rye and the summer annual or the Sudan grass together. And when you combine those into a system, that made it a little more increased your cost or increase the value of it to be able to cover land cost. We haven't done that here, but I think you can see by looking at that calendar, if you're going to graze those cool season perennials, and understand they don't have the production potential in the summer that the warm seasons, including the combination of those. Now, the drawback to the warm seasons, if there is one, if you look on that calendar, you've got to go way back to the previous April. So you're a little over a year from planting time until you can expect to be able to consistently graze that. And again, recall during the first production year, we're probably looking at only 75% of total production. You may have an opportunity out at the end of the seeding year after the first killing frost to have some light grazing out there, mostly to control some of the residue, but then expect the majority of the grazing to occur the following late May, early part of June on through September. So that's a little bit of an overview of some of the management things to think about, or management strategies to think about as you look at trying to decide on, in particular, whether to go for these cool seasons or warm seasons.
Thanks, Daren. And as we finish up, I have one more topic I want to spend about 5 minutes on, but feel free to type questions in the question box if you have them at this point, and we'll address those here in a moment. Also, if you'd rather speak up, I'll give you the opportunity to raise your hand and do that during our Q&A here in a moment. But the last little topic that I want to mention is insurance, because one of the things when we compare forages to row crops is, of course, row crops have very well-established insurance for corn and soybeans, for example. And then people are looking for something similar, right, that protects things on the forage side. And one thing on here, when you think about some of these things, maybe not on irrigated, you're not too worried about your production there, right? You got the center pivot to help you out, or whatever it is that you have for irrigation resources to keep that growing. Because certainly on the dryland side, once you get it established, the main risk that you run into there as far as your production each year is precipitation. And these perennial grasses would, of course, qualify for pasture, rangeland, and forage insurance, which is a rainfall index coverage. It's not necessarily insuring 4 AUMs or whatever your expected production is, but it is based off of annual rainfall, and you can insure a percentage of that. So as long as the perennial forage is intended for livestock grazing or haying, feed in general, it would qualify for this insurance coverage here with it. But this is something that you sign up for on an annual basis. So you sign up for it by December 1, and the coverage is for a calendar year. So as we started off this webinar, I mentioned that this idea of going to perennial forage on some of your crop acres is a multi-year decision, a multi-year commitment, which makes it very strategic. This too is part of that strategy, right? Because it's something you got to plan for and do each year. You can't just sign up for it because it's dry this year. You can't sign up for it in the middle of the year, for example. But most people are familiar with this that do have forages and cattle because it's become quite popular here in Nebraska over the last several years. We're seeing, upwards 10 million acres of grass insured with this each year at this point in time. You're covering 2 months of rainfall indexes. You can cover up to 90% of normal rainfall, and it is heavily subsidized at that 51 to 59% coverage level. So I just did a couple of very quick examples for you on how it would work. So let's say, for example, you've picked a 75% coverage level. That 100% expectation, which is built off of multiple years of history for rainfall for a 2-month interval. If you've insured 75% of that, which would be the blue bar here, and then that 2-month interval, they actually come back and reported that it was 44% of normal, then that would be basically 31 percentage points short of normal. That 0.31 would be taken times your coverage, your dollar value of coverage to determine your indemnity. So just quick example using Gage County. So we're just going north and east of Beatrice here a little bit. That happens to be grid 24434. And so that's the example grid I happen to pull up. You can check your own grid out working with your insurance agent to see how that works. This is coverage in that grid for grazing perennial grass, right? The base value was $56.30. And if you covered it at 90% of rainfall, that would give you about $50 worth of coverage. This is what I call base strategy. I usually recommend this to people who aren't sure where to put the coverage. Just spread it out over 2-month intervals throughout the entire year. So I went 15, 15, 20, 20, and 15, 15 in 2-month chunks here. That takes that $50 and spreads it out in a dollar value over the course of the year. These premium rates are their expectations for paying out. So we see that ranges anywhere from about 25% of the dollar value of the coverage down to about 10%. So that's, $1, $1.50, $1 to $2 basically an acre for each of those intervals, or about $8.60 total. The government pays a little over half of that. So the producer is basically on the hook for about $4 an acre, $4.21 in this example. Always look and see how that would pay out over time. So that $4.21 premium, if you go back over the last 20 years, so back to 2004, the average payout on that policy was about $7.28 an acre. So about a $3 an acre payout on that. The return on that is about $1.73 for each dollar the producer pays in, and about 70% of the time the indemnity outweighs the premium. And so you see some of these dry years popping in here, like 2022 and 2012 and 2011, where that $4 premium paid out anywhere from 4 to 1 or 3 to 1 type of payout. This is the equivalent insurance, I guess, protection for those dry years, and where you may not get all those AUMs that we projected on those examples that we did, and a chance to recapture that. And it is heavily subsidized, so you are able to capture basically a net return that's positive over the long term if you stick with it. So that's an example with the grazing. You can do a haying coverage. And so I just tossed this in. This is the exact same grid, exact same coverage in terms of spreading it out at 15%. But if you pick haying for that, Its base value goes up about fivefold, so you can get about a $250 base value. At 90% coverage, it's about a $225 amount of protection. So obviously everything just scales up here, including your premium. So instead of an $8 premium, you're looking at a $38 premium. And on the producer's net on that, instead of that $421, you're looking at $18.84 per acre for haying. Now, a lot of people ask about the hay piece. Can I graze it? So on and so forth. You can graze it. Haying is just that you intend to take at least one cutting of hay off of it. So keep that in mind as you go through. That's what you need to intend in order to qualify for the haying coverage. All it does is just bump up the dollar value. Producer loss ratio with rounding, it's 1.70, but basically it's exactly the same. If you don't round, let everything carry out to multiple decimal points. But that $18, roughly $19 premium returns roughly $32 on average over time. And we see the numbers come out here in terms of how that spreads. But, in some of these dry years that can be fairly significant, $50-$60 an acre addition right to your operation to help get you through that year. It's basically going to cover like an AUM more or less, right? So that is available for folks if they're interested in it as a part of this strategy to switching over to forages instead of row crops. And yeah, so I think at that we'll go ahead and wrap up here with just a couple of mentions. One of them is our standing forage tool. If you don't have haying equipment and you want to perhaps sell this as standing forage or maybe you don't have cattle for that matter, want to sell this as standing forage in the field for somebody else to take advantage of, we do have a tool available on our website, on the CAP website, to calculate what it's worth of standing forage in the field. And then I always emphasize to people that it's a tough choice. And as you're making these choices, it's important to think through all the different nuances, some of the different options that are available that we mentioned here today, but then also some of the different things that you're dealing with personally on your operation as far as things you're trying to achieve, and then the context of your operation that you're actually dealing with. So I do have an article up on our website on making smart choices in agriculture. And we talked about that as from a standpoint of just gathering good information and getting to a point where you're actually comfortable making the decision and knowing that you're ready to move forward with it. So I think with that, we're running up close to, we've been going about 45 minutes here. I think we want to open it up to questions that people may have. I'm looking in the chat to see if we've had anything come in yet. Are there questions from the audience? And if you have a question, we prefer to just ask it out loud. Please feel free to raise your hand and we can go ahead and get you unmuted so you can ask your question. Otherwise, please type your question into the chat box or the question box, I guess, and we can take a look at that. I'm not seeing any questions there, Daren. You seeing anything?
I do not.
We'll give a few more minutes. If anything comes in here, feel free to pipe up, raise your hand, or type it into the question box, and we can take a look at your questions there. Daren, what are some of the main things that people ask you on these perennial forages?
I mean, it's a lot of that is most of it's post-established questions, management in particular, a lot about the grazing on it, that sort of thing. So it's I know this establishment costs quite a bit of dollars to get to the point of doing that. I think is why there's some hesitancy, I think, to think about doing something a little bit different. And I know I always, this is not the first year that we've had had this type of question. It cycles around every couple of years, and we learn a little bit every time we do it as far as piecing some of this information together. But as you indicate, it's not an easy decision.
Yeah.
It's the big piece is that long-term commitment.
Yeah. And the interesting question came in, which, um, with alfalfa, we were talking grasses today, but the age-old question with alfalfa says any cost analysis for grazing fifth year and beyond on alfalfa. So that question of, you've established alfalfa, you've kind of used up its most productive years in the tail end. Keeping it around as a grazing resource. You want to speak to that a little bit on some of the things you've seen people do there and how that's worked?
Yeah, no, I think that's again, that's a question. I think traditionally, it's the aftermath grazing during the winter has been commonly done, but this is a little different situation here. I haven't thought much about that, but I do, it's again, the hay production piece is not cheap either. That costs a lot to harvest hay as well. And the grazing piece to that, I haven't honestly thought much about that, but I would say certainly you may have a year or two of grazing after that. But on the stands on the way out, I do know some producers do overseed that with some annuals. Some will overseed it with some perennials and graze it a little bit longer, and they use that as a method to get to a perennial grass stand. So I think the flexibility in a lot of options. It's not that we've got to replace corn and soybean with everything we plant these perennials to. The alfalfa is another one. One of the things I probably have thought about more than that is where these perennials fit into these cropping systems. Alfalfa is one that historically has been part of a cropping rotation. It's been taken out in particular as the corn prices have increased, and it's been a little more economically easy, if you will, to harvest grain crops sometimes than it is the food with hay production, in particular alfalfa, because it does have some can have some pretty high input costs as well, from both from an insect and a weed standpoint. So it's a different set of economics there. AUM wise, may be looking at a fifth year stand. Might be looking at probably an AUM per acre per month. So it's maybe a little less than that. Your fully productive alfalfa stands, first two harvests, you get nearly between 2/3 and 3/4 of your yield in those first two harvests. So, it's when they're going out. But that grazing alfalfa is another option. I don't know that we've got good data on that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You mentioned that interseeding, and that's where I've seen, or at least heard of people interseeding, especially for that third cut and maybe the last year of production or whatever. But you also, I know you mentioned to me before, because we talked about the fertilizer costs of some of these grasses, right? And
Yep.
if you mix a legume in there, maybe your fertilizer costs go down quite a bit on that annual side of things too,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Okay.
It's you're not limited to just the scenarios we talked about today, just more to paint a picture of some of the expectations.
Yeah, a little more of a comment than a question, but one of them came in. One of the things to consider on these costs of forage per acre, and this gets to the system things that you were alluding to with that
Yep.
graphic that you had up there, but creating forage resources on a given land unit may allow you to improve perennial systems across your operation, right? So there are benefits beyond just the plus and minus on the acre that we put the forage on, but there's other grass acres that you can maybe get more out of complementary wise by adding some forage on your existing croplands.
Yeah, and that's a good point. That was one of the points Mary brought up last week with the annuals. They do have some value there, is that they can provide some grazing, basically to provide some relief to your other grass pastures. So, to me, I think if you have grass pastures, I think the thinking about adding some more is a little bit different, but a little bit easier decision than it is if you have 0 acres of grass and you're trying to make that decision to start. But the complementary piece is another way to look at this. And that was Jeff. That was what I was trying to get across with the combination of the cool seasons and the warm seasons.
Yeah, that's a good point on there, because we often speak in terms of these opportunity costs or other things that you can be doing with resources, but certainly everybody's operating in a system, and sometimes there's some complementary benefits that can make a big difference when you add other resources to your operation, like perennial grasses, right? So I'm not seeing any other questions come in, and it looks like we're getting close to the top of the hour. So I think I'll go ahead and we'll wrap things up today. And I'll just say thank you to everyone for joining us. Once again, these webinars are recorded. So a recording of this webinar will be posted on our website, cap.unl.edu. And you'll also be able to register for our other upcoming webinars at that same URL. We'll be back next Thursday, same time, with another webinar from our Center for Ag Profitability. So we appreciate your feedback on this current webinar, and you'll be getting an evaluation that'll pop up as you exit Zoom today. We especially appreciate any suggestions you have for future webinars, whether it be specific topics you'd like to see covered, or specific speakers that you would like us to invite to present. So thank you again, Daren, for your help today on this.
I certainly enjoyed this.
Yeah, great expertise, and we're always glad to visit with producers about this. If you have specific questions, our contact information is up there on the screen. We live for the real examples, basically, is what I would say, because we learn from those as much as we do from putting together these slides. So thanks again for joining us, and wish everybody a great and pleasant afternoon.